Welcome to the Center for the Virtual Study of the Constitution of the United States with Dr. Bill O'Brien. Here is your host, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
This is Bill O'Brien. It's 4 p.m. on Tuesday afternoon, and it is a pleasure to be with you once again on the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution on the Horn. We've been away for a few days, a little bit better than a week, and I am chomping at the bit. I can't wait to get back. I was so afraid that everybody would forget about James Madison and the time I was gone. So it is a pleasure to be back with you. It's a pleasure to be on, and it's an opportunity that I cherish. Is an opportunity to spend time with you on issues that I believe are incredibly, I think they're interesting, but more important than interest is their importance. I think that they are very, very significant. I have to believe that what we're about, what we hope to do over the course of our time together will be of value to people as they become more aware of the fact that we're on and they tune in. Let me begin with at least a comment, and I feel absolutely compelled to make a comment about the situation. I obviously wasn't on the air yesterday, but I, like everybody else in the country or in the world practically, I was tuned in on watching the events in Boston, and as many of you know or can guess if you just listen to me for a few minutes. I grew up in Boston, and I have a brother in the area. He lives about 50 minutes, about an hour outside of Boston now. But we grew up in Boston. In fact, we lived for a time in Dorchester, which was the community where the little 8-year-old boy lived who was killed in the terror attack yesterday. And I've been kind of torn up. In fact, my wife made the comment to me last night as we were watching it. I told her, I said, I really ought to turn this thing off. I just can't. And she said, well, it's home to you, and obviously you feel a little bit more than other people that are, that have never been there or don't know people there or whatever. I could go on and on, but I've been reading reports of people that were in the race, the people that lived in the city, that grew up in the city, that ran in the race. I was just reading one in the New York Review of Books, the latest New York Review of Books that just came out today. The lead story in it is from one of the runners in the Boston Marathon who was in it yesterday and was talking about what happened, and he was talking about the race and the milestones and the tremendously optimistic positive. He was talking about the psychological lift that you get if you're running in the race when you just don't think you can make it anymore. And then you take that last right and you turn onto Boylston Street, and there, about 2 meters ahead of you, is the finish line. You're so excited because you just don't know if you can make it or not. And then when you make that last turn, and suddenly there it is. And to take that euphoria that almost every runner has to have as they get that close to the finish line, to take that euphoria and turn it into something as evil as what happened yesterday is a little bit hard to deal with. I'm sure that the conversation and the speculation and the suggestion and the innuendo and all of these things that revolve around yesterday's events in Boston will continue to draw our attention for a number of days, I'm sure. The fact of the matter is, as you read, you're reading most people who are saying very positively, we will go on, and this is the kind of situation that shows what kind of people we are and all that. And the fact of all of this, there's a tendency sometimes or an inclination to believe that some of this stuff is rhetoric. Fact of the matter is, it's very true. We will get beyond it, as will the people who have been directly hurt by it. Somehow they will get beyond it. They're just going to have a tougher time than the rest of us. But all we can do is kind of is kind of keep them in our prayers, keep them in our thoughts, and realize, it seems to me, just realize how and I do. Maybe it's because I'm getting near, as I get older in life, I think of such things a little bit more often than I ever did before. But the fact of the matter is, life is fragile, and those that we love and those that we're the closest to can be taken from us so quickly and so suddenly and so unexpectedly. And perhaps one of the most difficult things to deal with is the thought that that could happen, and that there was something that you wanted to say or something that you wanted to do with a particular person. There was something that you wanted to say to a particular person that you never got the chance to say. And so the fact of the matter is, say it while you can say it. And, make those hugs just a little bit tighter and a little bit more frequent, and recognize how much the people that are closest to us mean. And just know that if something were to happen, at least you've got all your bases touched. And those you care about know how you feel, and you know how they feel about you. And I guess that's, if we all feel that way, we'll nobody, no matter what kind of terrorism they pull, is going to basically break through that. And so, that's really all I can say. I feel, as I mentioned, I grew up there. I went to school there. The finish line is right beside the Boston Public Library, which is, many of you, if you've watched it on television, you've seen it. It's a beautiful facility, and absolutely, awesome building. Just to go inside and look at the marble and the staircases and everything, it's a classic. And I spent, personally spent so many years there. I went to kind of put it in perspective, Fenway Park, where the Red Sox play, is about a little bit more than a mile away from Copley Square, maybe about a mile and a half from Copley Square, and about a mile beyond that is where I went to school, both high school and I went to 6 years of high school and 4 years of college. And the college I went to no longer exists, but it was a 4-year teachers college in Boston. It was right across the street from where I went to high school. So actually, I went to school for 10 years in the same place, and I used to do research in the Boston Public Library, and you could walk. It's about 2 miles. And you just walk straight down Boylston Street, down Huntington Avenue, and then turn onto Boylston Street, and you're right there at the Boston Public Library, and the YMCA is right near there, and Boston Symphony Hall is right near there, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful place. But yesterday it wasn't so beautiful, and it was painful, and I just felt that, all day long I kept saying the first thing I've got to do is make it would be absolutely unconscionable to go on the air with people and not at least pay homage to the people that are going through so much, and to thank the people that are helping them. And of course, the stories of kindness and friendship from total strangers are endless, and that's kind of what it's all about. So, again, I think all of us have, our hearts are a little bit heavier today than they would be on normal days, and it hardly seems appropriate to go back to the, spend time going back to the 18th century and, talk about Madison and the things we've been talking about here on at the Virtual Center. But fact of the matter is, the whole idea of a Virtual Center is the idea of capturing the interest and capturing the substance of what makes the Constitution and its ramifications so significant, not only for us as citizens in this country, but for the world at large. And I think it's very substantive, and I kind of think, that in some ways, on a day like this, more than being inappropriate, it's kind of very appropriate to begin to basically go back and revisit and reflect for a time on what makes us who we are and what we are. And so with that, I want you to know how much I appreciate the time that we have together, and I hope that I can make our time together valuable and worthwhile for you. Hopefully entertaining. I'll do the best I can, but I'm hoping that it'll be informative, because I operate on the assumption, and what really prompted me in the very beginning, when this idea for this kind of a program first surfaced, what motivated me was that I really believe, as I'm about close to 50 years that I've been in the classroom, most of them at the college level. And as I begin to see what students know and understand and don't know and don't understand, I really begin to feel that I have some things that I think I have some things to share that I think people ought to hear and ought to know. And so at this point in my life, I feel that this is probably the greatest opportunity I have to try to leave at least some sort of a to make a footprint, so to speak, and to leave something substantive. And I mentioned in a previous program, and I'll mention it again because it occurs to me once again, as it does frequently. One of the colleagues, closest friends that I have that I respect very, very much is John Kaminsky, who has probably done more work on the Constitution and its writing and its ratification than anybody. There's a 800-page book that came out in October of 2010 by Pauline Meyer, which is entitled Ratification, and it goes through the states and tells the story of ratification in each state by state. And what she points out in her preface, this was as of 2010, was that her book is strongest in the states which John Kaminsky's project has completed, has done the work on, and on the states, that's 8 of the 13, and on the 5 states that the ratification project that John heads, on the states that it's still working on, her chapters in that area are understandably not quite, are lacking, are not quite as substantive as the others, because the research hasn't been done and the documentation hasn't been made available to everybody. But in a sense, she basically makes the point that John Kaminsky, probably more than anybody, has made the resources available which give people like her, professionals like her, an opportunity to tell the story that really has never been told before in the detail, and with the assurance that she has, that what we've got our hands on is just about all there is. And so whatever we're going to find about ratification, with the possible exception of a letter turning up here or there, most of we're going to have at our disposal, we've got now, thanks to John Kaminsky. And the point that I was making is, one of the things that I have appreciated more than anything is that John has spent the last several years writing book after book after book. He's doing everything he can do to make sure that when he leaves this earth, he's going to leave behind what he's been able to accomplish and what he knows for the rest of us. So that rather than having to go back and reinvent the wheel, so to speak, and rediscover the things that John has discovered, he's leaving it there for us, which means that when he's not here, we can go on from there based on what he's done. I feel somewhat the same way, and that's why I value this time on the Horn, and I value the opportunity to come to you with this kind of stuff, and you have the freedom, since it's not a regular credit class, you have the freedom to turn it off or to exit out or disconnect or change channels or whatever you need to do. So if I'm meeting your needs, then it'll be worthwhile. If I'm not meeting your needs, then I understand if you go elsewhere. So with that, let's go back and I'm not going to review Federalist number 10 because I think we finished that. What I want to do, as I mentioned the last time we were together, is I'd like to look at Madison's Federalist 51, which is kind of a continuation. It kind of builds on Federalist number 10. And in order to do it, I thought I would introduce it with something that's a little bit more theoretical. I mentioned that this is not a credit class, and obviously it's not, but this is kind of a teaching strategy. It's a theory that I have found over my years of teaching to be very helpful for students in order to conceptualize and put things together, and it provides a base of reference so that when we talk, we can talk in very, very specific terms about this theory, and if everybody's comfortable with the theory, then everybody will know what we're talking about, even though, strangers to the theory wouldn't have any idea what we were talking about. I think it'll become clear. What I'm basically talking about is looking at a theory of society, explaining a little bit of what it is, and then basically looking at Madison as an example of a kind of society that is emerging, a kind of political structure that is emerging in the Constitution, and it falls within the frame of reference defined by this theory. So in a sense, it gives us an opportunity to apply theory to a real situation, to take it to a situation like Federalist Number 10 and actually apply it, and thereby enhance our understanding and meaning of that information based on the theory. The application of theory is very, very difficult. It's something that our students, and I don't want to get diverted by going off into the wild blue yonder here in terms of education again. I'm sure we'll be back to it over and over again. I can't help it. It's kind of where I am. But the fact of the matter is that one of the areas where our students in our education system today tend to be, I believe, woefully deficient is their ability to apply knowledge. And what I mean basically is to take information or take knowledge and apply it in a totally different context to a totally different set of political or social or economic circumstances, and basically use the information from one context in a totally different context, and thereby understand or apply what we've learned to a new situation. Our students are very, very, very deficient in this. They are unable to do it. I believe part of the reason is because many of our teachers have not had an education that has prepared them to do this. Many of our teachers have never done it either. Let me be blunt. They've been in classroom situations where they've not been asked to do this kind of thing either. So there's no way in the world that we can expect them to pass it on to students. I was listening to a presentation today. This is not a diversion, but it's very appropriate right now. It's a classic example. It's a perfect example of what I was just trying to get across. At lunch today, I went to our local Rotary Club, and a good friend of mine was delivering the program. And he was talking about education, primarily education in West Virginia, but education generally. And he made a point that he's an admissions counselor, a recruiter here in southern West Virginia and in the surrounding states, Virginia, the Carolinas, Maryland, Pennsylvania, etc. And basically he's looked at higher education in a number of states in this region. And basically he made this comment, and I think it really is something that hit me very, very hard. I think it's very telling, and it's something that really makes the point. And what he basically was telling these folks in the Rotary Club, that in our universities, for the most part, colleges and universities, in teacher education programs, the bulk of our classroom teachers, our education majors, are coming from the bottom 60% of our college enrollments, our classes, in terms of grade point. And he made the point that many of them will have a minimum grade point requirement of 2.5 or 2.75 or something like that in order to gain admission into teacher education programs, which lead to teacher certification upon graduation. And his point was that most of the students who go into the teacher education programs tend to be not in the upper echelon of their college class, but the bottom 60%. Now, again, you can say, well, if there are admission standards, if it's not a totally open enrollment situation, and if students have to basically meet muster in order to get into college in the first place, then that makes the lower 60% of those admitted not as bad as if you were talking about the lower 60% in an open enrollment situation. So that kind of takes the curse off that figure, so to speak. But his point was, and this is the point I want to make, while we basically admit students into teacher education with a 2.7 grade point requirement, somehow we expect our teachers to teach students at a 3.8 grade point requirement. In other words, we basically believe that we can continue to take our teachers from the lower echelons of our admission classes and somehow turn them into something which is going to mean that when they go into the classrooms to teach, they're going to teach at a level way beyond where they are. I think that's expecting an awful lot from a college education, that it's going to perform that kind, that a student is going to come into college at a 2.7 level and is going to basically graduate at a 3.8 level. But that's the level at which we expect our students perform and teachers to perform. We're expecting our teachers to go into school and teach students, who are going to test out at high GPAs because they've had such wonderful instruction. First of all, it's not reasonable to expect that from our students, but more important, it's almost impossible to expect our teachers to do that. And so, and one of the areas, there are many, but one of the areas that I feel is really lacking is this idea of the ability to apply knowledge in different situations. And what the way I teach in classes is by asking essay questions. Every question that I ever give on an exam requires students to apply knowledge to something, to use knowledge to answer a question or to take it in a totally different context to something else. I never ask students what anything is. I always say, knowing what something is, how can we use it to understand something else? And while that's very difficult, it allows me as an instructor to evaluate how well students know information, because you really have to understand what you're doing. You have to understand information in order to apply it in a different context. And if you can't do it, or if you make errors doing it, then that is that indicates very clearly that there's not a clear understanding of the information, which is, as a teacher, what you're after on an evaluation anyway. When you're evaluating students, you're trying to find out not what they recognize, but what they understand. And the easiest way to know if they understand it is by asking them to apply it and then evaluating their knowledge and understanding that way. So that's basically, the way I operate. So that's what I want to do today, because this is kind of the way I operate. What I'm effectively talking about here is trying to create a theoretical context and then looking at substantive information within that context and see if we can use the context in such a way to understand the full meaning of the information more clearly, if that makes sense. Let me talk for a little bit. We can spend the first portion of our time together maybe on this, and then we can, I thought we might look at Madison's Federalist number 51 as an example of the theory that we'll be looking at. The theory that I have in mind is a study that came out in the late 19th century in Germany, and the author was a German scholar, German sociologist named Ferdinand Tonnies, T as in Tom, Tonnies, N as in never. So Tonnies with an umlaut over the O. So instead of calling it Tonnies, Ton, it's effectively with the umlaut, it's pronounced Tonnies. But we don't have to get technical here. I don't want to be evaluated on my German, believe me. But in the late, and I don't have the publication date right at my fingertips right now, but when Ferdinand Tonnies wrote this study, the title of his research was called Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft, which is community and society, translates. And in German is UND, of course. And so Gemeinschaft is community, Gesellschaft is society. And what Ferdinand Tonnies does in his book, it's available in paperback. I've read it. In fact, in a graduate course on history of education that I used to teach at the University of Wisconsin a number of years ago, this was required reading for graduate students in that class, and because it was based on application of theory as well, being the fact that these were graduate students, and this book was required reading. And so when I tell you, this is what the book is about, then you can. It's a good way to get across. What Tonnies does is he defines and gives example after example after example of each of these ideal situations, which he calls the ideal community and the ideal society, or the ideal Gemeinschaft and the ideal Gesellschaft. And what he's trying to do is get his readers to have a working knowledge and appreciation of each of these ideal states. And so by giving as many examples as he gives of Gemeinschaft, he believes that his reader is totally enmeshed and totally comfortable with the meaning of Gemeinschaft, so that as you look at particular situations in a social context, you can basically say, well, that smacks of Gemeinschaft, or it doesn't. And then, of course, the Gesellschaft, which is a society, is the other end of the spectrum. So if you assume that you have a spectrum, at one end is the ideal Gemeinschaft, and at the other end is the perfect Gesellschaft. And I'm reading directly the available information on Gemeinschaft. So if you'll forgive me for reading text, but I think it's very valuable. Gemeinschaft, Tonnies says, is an association in which individuals are oriented to the large association as much as, if not more than, their own self-interest. So Gemeinschaft is a place, is a way of life where individuals who live in it are more inclined to put the best interests of the association ahead of their own private self-interest, the best interest of the community, the best interest. In fact, Tonnies makes this point. He says if you really want to understand what is probably as close as anything you can think of to a perfect Gemeinschaft, think of the word village and what you think about when you think of village, which is a little town, which is a little community where everybody knows everybody else. There's a post office and a church and a department store or whatever. But the whole idea of a village is it's small and it's interconnected in such a way that everybody not only knows everybody else, but everybody cares about everybody else, and everybody knows everything about everybody else. So it's the kind of living existence where if you were sick, if you had the flu, anybody in the community could bang on the door and bring you chicken soup. And you would not be surprised, because that's exactly what you would do for your neighbors. It's that kind of an environment. It's an ideal. If you eliminate all the realities of today's world and you think on the ideal, just imagine the perfect village or the perfect community where everybody knew everybody else, everybody genuinely cared about everybody else, everybody was genuinely concerned about everybody else. What kind of day-to-day existence that would mean in terms of the way we lived our lives. Knowing, for example, that if you got in trouble, there's not just one person that you could turn to for a loan or for help or for assistance or whatever, but you can almost turn to anybody in the community. Everybody in the community knows that everybody else in the community would put their plight at the top of their agenda. That would be everybody's priority, was to help you out of your pain or help you get a handle on the terrible situation that you were in, whatever it might be. Tonnies basically says then that, everybody has self-interest. It's not that you don't have self-interest, but you're always willing to put it on the shelf, to put it aside in favor of the public interest. For example, furthermore, he says, individuals in Gemeinschaft are regulated by common mores or norms or beliefs. People tend to believe the same thing. People tend to value the same thing. And the result is that they tend to agree on what's appropriate behavior and what the responsibilities of members of that particular community are to each other and to the society at large. And basically the idea is that every individual knows that there's no place else to live except there. These are your people. These are the people you feel a kinship with. These are the people that you feel a spiritual connection and relation to. These are the people on the face of this earth that you care the most about. These are the people who care most about you. And you begin to realize, if you ever thought of this, but most people don't, but if you ever thought of it, you can't imagine living anywhere else but in this community, because this is where you belong. This is where you feel that you make the most contribution, because it's obvious that the way people feel about you means that whatever you do, whatever your profession happens to be, whatever it is, that what you do makes a valuable contribution to the good of the whole. And so if anything ever happened to the community, the individuals within it would be in serious trouble because they are so connected to that community. It's what makes them function. He says Gemeinschafts or Gemeinschaft-like communities, he in German he uses the term Gemeinschaften, which would be communities, Gemeinschaft communities, are broadly characterized, he says, by a moderate division of labor, strong personal relationships, strong families, and relatively simple social institutions. A moderate division of labor is very important, because what that means is everybody's not equal. Let's forget that. We're not talking about that. Everybody's not equal except in the contribution that they make to the best interest of the community at large. Let me give you the classic example. I am a major employer. My business employs 40% of the working people in the community. So their livelihood, their income for 40% of this community is directly dependent on how successful I am as a manager and as a businessman. You basically pick up on 1 day a week. You're the guy that drives the truck that goes to the back of my building and picks up the trash. You haul the trash away. The community could not function without my business because so many people in the community are dependent on it. But on the other hand, so many people in the community are also dependent on living in a clean environment, a healthy, clean environment, which means what you contribute as a person who picks up trash is as important to the benefit of the entire community as what I do. We don't have a ranked system where certain people are more important to the community than other people, because the number one priority is the welfare and best interest of the community at large. If it's healthy, everybody in it is healthy. And the only way it can be healthy is when everybody is able to contribute to the maximum of their own ability, whatever that might be. So in a sense, there's a division of labor because everybody doesn't do the same thing. Everybody doesn't make the same income. So in that sense, people are unequal. But from the perspective of the welfare of the community, everybody equally contributes to the health of the environment within which everybody in the community lives and depends. So there is a division of labor. There are very strong personal relationships. We talked about that. Strong families. In a sense, he said, in such societies, there's seldom a need to enforce social control externally due to the collective sense of loyalty that individuals feel for the society as a whole, feel for the group. So you don't have a large police force. It's kind of like Mayberry. Let's use that as an example. It's kind of like Mayberry, and most of us know that Andy spends darn little of his time, at least the time that we see, catching criminals and enforcing the law. Most of what Andy's doing is helping people solve their problems in the community. Mayberry is Gemeinschaft. Mayberry is what everybody wants their community to be. Mayberry is what causes people to move from one place to the other if they can afford it and if they're able to generate their own income. Mayberry seems to be what people are looking for as they relocate from one place to the other. Everybody wants to go to Mayberry. And the fact of the matter is, Mayberry is an ideal. It's an ideal state. It doesn't exist, but on the other hand, it's a target, or it's a goal. It's something that everybody wants their community, their way of life to be. This is where we want to raise our children. This is the kind of community we want our kids to be raised in. And we'll do whatever we can to find it. Sometimes what we do seems to be the right thing when in fact it might not be the right thing. I'm thinking, for example, of the number of our communities around the country now that are what we call gated communities, where those who can afford it live in communities which hire security people to keep out people that they don't want to interact with, that they don't want to relate with. In other words, I find this ironic. I'm just going to throw this out because I don't want to get into this necessarily because it would kind of take us off track. But most people see the beauty of American society is the idea that what makes equality of opportunity in American society so wonderful is the fact that if you can make it, if you are successful and you are able to do it, in this society, this gives you the opportunity to go to the place which most approaches the place you would most like to live and raise your children. In other words, we see the beauty of American society for the opportunity it provides to let us go and live where we want to live. But the irony, and I don't think it's necessarily a positive, the other side of that coin is that one of the things about equality of opportunity in this society is that it tends to give some people the freedom they need to not have to live with people that they don't want to live with. In other words, it's not a question of going and living with people that you want your children to interact with. That's the most obvious, most common perspective that people have. But the other side of the coin is that it also enables us to remove ourselves from interaction with people that we don't want to interact with on a daily basis, even if we have to put up, guard posts and various other things. So I would suggest to you that is an interesting combination of Gemeinschaft, but it's also Gesellschaft as well. But we'll get into that. So basically, what Tonnies is pointing out is that in Gemeinschaft societies, There's seldom a need to enforce social control externally due to the collective sense of loyalty that individuals feel for the society, for the community. So because people are going to do what needs to be done anyway, you don't need a visible police presence to force people to do the right thing when, in fact, people in this community are going to do the right thing anyway. That's what a Gemeinschaft is. And so it's kind of like a classic example of this would be, in some ways, the state of nature that John Locke talked about in his second treatise on civil government. To John Locke, the state of nature it's usually defined, and of course he defines it that way, as a place where man is totally free. But in being totally free, Locke says, there are rules. It is, and he opens by saying, while the state of nature provides liberty, it is not the same as license. And what he means is, while you are free in the state of nature, you are not free to do whatever you want to do. That there are rules, there are responsibilities of living in the state of nature. There are laws. And what Locke says is the law of nature is common sense, is reason. And his faith in the stability and security of the state of nature is based on the fact that man's common sense, man's reason, will tell him that if I want people to respect me and my property, then I've got to respect them. And if you can rely on that, and if you can be sure that your neighbor will think the same way as you do, the result is Gemeinschaft, if you think about it. If people believe the same things, buy into the same mores and value systems and all the rest of it, and you don't need a military or a police force to enforce it, then the fact of the matter is you're approaching Gemeinschaft. You're approaching the ideal. So that's what Locke is talking about in the state of nature. Man's reason, man's common sense causes him to think in certain ways, and the result is he believes certain things, he recognizes certain things, and he can basically rely on the fact that those around him will make the same kinds of conclusions, reach the same kind of conclusions, and the result is a relatively peaceful society. And so, therefore, if it becomes necessary to leave the state of nature and create society and government, which is what Locke talks about, then it's very obvious that for the most part the state of nature is not a bad place. So therefore, you don't need a government with a whole lot of power. You don't need an absolute government like Thomas Hobbes proposes, because people aren't desperate to leave the state of nature. It's reasonable. It makes sense to leave the state of nature. It's convenient to create a government and assign it responsibilities that you have to perform yourself within the state of nature, and to limit government to just those responsibilities. That's the social contract. And, that's basically what we're talking about. So while it's rational, and while, as we'll see, it smacks more of Gesellschaft than Gemeinschaft, the fact of the matter is, the more commonality and agreement there is within the community, the more Gemeinschaft-like the society is. Tonnies says that order in Gemeinschaft exists based principally on natural law, resulting from the commonly held beliefs of the members of Gemeinschaft. Historically, he says, Gemeinschaft societies are racially and ethnically homogeneous. And this is important. Racially and ethnically homogeneous. If everybody's of the same race, then that makes the commonality, the community, much easier to build. If everybody is of different races, it's a potential divider rather than a unifier. And the same thing is true with ethnicity. If everybody is ethnically the same, if everybody has the same nationality, the same background, the same heritage, if everybody's ancestors come from the same place, and everybody's historical experience is the same, the more commonality there is, the easier it is to build Gemeinschaft, to have Gemeinschaft. So it stands to reason, as Tonnies says, that logically, in looking at it historically, Gemeinschaft societies tend to be racially and ethnically homogeneous. The more heterogeneous you are, the more divided you are, the more difficult it is to create Gemeinschaft. Tonnies saw the family as the most perfect expression of Gemeinschaft. And if you think about what family means in the broadest sense, in terms of blood relationships and kinships, it doesn't matter what your differences are with family. I mean, everybody has family with, everybody has the bad stepchild or whatever you want to call it. The fact of the matter is there's still family. We see problems all the time between children and parents, between children and their mother. But ultimately, when push comes to shove, what you usually find is that when things get really tough, the fact that this is a relationship between mother and child matters. That's almost never overcome. Anyway, if you get that, you begin to understand the nature of Gemeinschaft, as Tonnies would like us to mention it. Gesellschaft is just the opposite. And Gesellschaft, which is translated into society or civil society, in contrast to Gemeinschaft, describes association which, for the individuals within it, the larger association never takes on more importance than individual self-interest. Individual self-interest is always the most important thing, rather than the group. Whenever it comes down to the whole group or me, it's always me. My priorities take priority all the time in a Gesellschaft. Gesellschaft, what holds Gesellschaft together, what makes for a society, is that the individuals within it are all acting in their own self-interest. And he uses as an example a modern business. And he said a modern business is a good example of Gesellschaft. The workers, the managers, and the owners may have very little in common in terms of shared orientations or beliefs. They may totally have a different perspective, the owners, the managers, and the online workers, so to speak. They may all have different priorities and different sets of agendas and all of this. They may not care deeply for the product they're making. They may not even care. In fact, you hear stories all the time about workers sabotaging the product as a way to kind of demonstrate their freedom or their individuality, or I am a person, and while I work on an assembly line, I am not a machine, I am a human being. And so what they'll do is they'll cause other people to acknowledge that by somehow disrupting the system in order to cause the whole system to stop for a moment and recognize the people within it. They may not care about the product, but the fact of the matter is they realize, rationally, common sense, they realize that it's in everybody's self-interest to come to work, get paid, make money, and thus the business continues. In other words, the business is comprised not of people who all have the same value system and the same belief system as Gemeinschaft does. A business includes workers, and includes managers, it includes stockholders, owners. And their priorities are always different. But the one thing they've got in common is that they're all dependent on the business. So therefore, they realize that it's in their self-interest that the business be successful. So for a number of different reasons, they all end up doing what is necessary to keep the business afloat. And Tonnies makes the comment that if you take this business analogy to its extreme, Gesellschaft is the German term for company. And I think you can understand what that means. Unlike Gemeinschaft societies or Gemeinschaften, Gesellschaften emphasizes secondary relationships rather than familial or community ties. And there's generally less individual loyalty to the society as a whole. Individuals see their priorities from an individual perspective. Individuals always make decisions based on what's in their own self-interest, what's best for them. Individuals will always look at relationship with other individuals from a rather selfish, personal perspective. They look at relationships not in terms of the good of the whole or the importance of the community or any of those things we talked about earlier, but they look at relationships with other people around them from a very self-interested perspective. To put it in today's terms, in Gesellschaft, everybody seems to have an agenda. Everybody has a plan, a strategy. Relationships are never ends in themselves, but almost always are the means to another end. People are nice to each other, not because they genuinely love each other or feel a sense of community or connection with each other. People are nice to each other because at some point in time it may benefit them to have done that. The example that I use in class, I don't know whether it's a good one, but it's the one I'm comfortable with. I use it all the time. Just picture a husband and wife who are going to the company Christmas party. It's going to be held at the local country club, and everybody from the office is going to be there. The stockholders and their wives, and all the managers and all the frontline supervisors, and the workers are going to be there with their wives as well. It's a company Christmas party. And just imagine the husband and wife getting ready to go to this Christmas party. And they're in their bedroom, and the husband and wife, and she's sitting at the dressing table, and he's in the bathroom shaving. And basically what they're doing is having a conversation about the Christmas party that's going to come that night. And you can hear her say, "I can't stand the people you work with. I dread tonight like the plague. I don't want to go. Is there any way in the world that we can not go to this? I hate it. Everybody's backstabbing everybody else. Everybody's talking about everybody else. You can't trust anybody. Everybody looks you over to make sure that your clothes are color coordinated and that you have the right shoes on and that your jewelry matches the outfit you have on. And everybody's looking at the way you do your hair and the way you do your nails and all of these things. You're inspected as if it was TSA going through an airport. And people are just looking for things that they can use against you. And then what they'll do for weeks after the Christmas party is talk about, in a negative way, about the people who are at the party. Is there any way in the world that we can avoid going to this? And then you picture the husband sticking his head out the bathroom door and saying, "Look, I'm a vice president in this company. I've got 20 years of my life invested in this company. There's going to be an opening for district manager. And I ought to get it. And while going to the Christmas party may not get it for me, not going to the Christmas party will definitely cost me the promotion. So therefore, make the best of it. Suck it up Anybody can put it. Anybody can put up with anything for 3 hours. Suck it up. Smile. Pretend that you love everybody. Go in there and have a good time. We're going to go to this thing, and damn it, we're going to have a good time. I would argue that that kind of a relationship is a perfect Gesellschaft type of situation. Every relationship amongst the people involved is a self-interested one. Nobody trusts anybody else. Most of the time, there aren't that many people that genuinely like everybody. One of the questions I often ask students in this situation is just take a moment and close your eyes. Just sit back, throw your head back, close your eyes, and think. In a real pinch, in a real life or death situation, if you were in a totally desperate life or death situation and you desperately needed help, how many real friends could you call? I'm not talking about acquaintances here. I'm not talking about colleagues at work. I'm talking about people that you know, without fail, without question, have your back. That if you turn around, you know they're there. These are people that would literally make the ultimate sacrifice. They would lay it down. They would die for you if you were in trouble. And if they were responsible for helping you get through it, they would never look for a return or for payback. They would never look for payment. They would never look for anything, because they know that if the situation was reversed, you'd do the same thing for them. What I'm asking you is, how many people do you know that you could say, in an ideal social situation, actually belong in Gemeinschaft? Or how many people that you come across in your day-to-day lives function in a more Gesellschaft-like situation? And I would suggest to you that a mobile society, a society where people pick up and move every couple of years, a society in which people jump from job to job, career to career, profession to profession, that kind of a world is purely a Gesellschaft-driven world, because it's one in which your own self-interest is driving everything you do and every decision you make. It determines what you spend. It determines where you vacation. It determines where your kids go to school. It determines which church you go to. It determines what you drive. It determines what you read. It determines the music you listen to, the movies you like, the movies you attend. The plays you find most rewarding. Everything about you is driven by what other people, the image or the impression, the message that you're trying to send out to other people about you. A story oftentimes is the number of people that will leave copies of the New York Times and the Washington Post and Forbes magazine, or the Wall Street Journal, or one of these, the New York Review of Books or something like that on their coffee table, primarily because when people come into the house, they want people to believe that they read this stuff. And actually, up in the bathroom are copies of Playboy and Penthouse and all this other stuff. But you don't want people to know you read that stuff. You want them to believe you read the good stuff. And so it's never the real you. What people see is never the real you, because that would make you vulnerable. That would make you susceptible. And in a Gesellschaft type of situation, you can never afford that, because ultimately your own self-interest is always what drives the relationships. In a Gesellschaft, social cohesion typically derives from a more elaborate division of labor, where one's salary, for example, dictates or determines his value to the community or to the society. Such societies obviously tend to be divided rather than united. They are more susceptible to class conflict between rich and poor, between workers and managers, or workers and owners, if you will. They tend to be more racially explosive, more ethnically explosive, and ultimately, I'm hoping as we get to the completion of our first hour together today, as I pull this together, and then we'll take a break and you can kind of think on it for a few minutes. Basically, what we're suggesting is that obviously the Gesellschaft is in many, many ways the direct opposite of Gemeinschaft. Okay. The only thing that Ferdinand Tonnies, the author, asks his readers to accept, to realize, is that as we look at the history of the world, we are looking at a history which is moving us more towards a Gesellschaft world. We are moving away from Gemeinschaft and toward Gesellschaft. History absolutely suggests that there's no other way to look at it. When you used to go back to the idea of the tribal society or the community, the peoples or the communities where the senior citizens were, if you think of the old movies, the cowboy movies example, where you would look at the Indian tribes, the Native American tribes, and ways of life, civilizations. The senior citizens would be the chiefs. They would be the ones that, the argument being that because they have lived longer and they have a wider array of experiences, that their age, their experience, basically gives them the license to basically make decisions for the entire group. And everybody kind of accepts that. We've gone from society historically into a society a mobile society where people move around for advantage. Life has become a human chess game where we manipulate situations and we manipulate opportunities. We create artificial situations in order to maneuver our children into the optimum situations. We will go into absolutely inordinate debt, extreme debt, in order to send our children to the kind of schools where they're going to rub shoulders and interact and network with the right people. And so one of the social experiences that typifies our life in Gesellschaft is an opportunity to network, which is an opportunity to rub shoulders with people, all of whom are looking to better their own self-interest. And so the assumption is, if you put yourself in a room with a bunch of other people who are looking to benefit their own self-interest, the result is going to be positive for everybody. But the fact of the matter is, everybody would choose, which is Gesellschaft, because it's a rational choice. But everybody would choose Gemeinschaft if it was available. Why isn't Gemeinschaft available? Most people believe that Gemeinschaft is a dream. It's an ideal. That's not the way the world is. I wish it was that way, but it's not that way. We will see in Federalist 51, Madison makes the statement, if men were angels, we wouldn't need a government at all. And then he basically begins to lay out the ingredients of a government based on the fact that we're dealing with people who are not angels. In other words, we are dealing with human beings who cannot or will not live according to the dictates of a Gemeinschaft. So therefore, the only alternative we have left is to put together a political system which deals with the reality of Gesellschaft. And we saw that in Federalist number 10. We're at 5 minutes after the hour. Let's pause for 4 or 5 minutes and stand up and stretch and take a deep breath. And if it's possible, if you walk outside and some air or whatever, we'll be right back. This is Bill back with you. Absolutely beautiful music. I enjoyed that very, very much. I hope you did as well. I hope you've had a chance to think a little bit about, if anybody asks you what you're doing tonight, please don't tell them that you're on some kind of strange drugs or whatever. I spent the afternoon thinking about Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. But it's a very interesting, if you think about it, it's a very, very interesting concept. And let me suggest why. If you think about it, as an example, let's talk a little bit about application, and then let's apply it to what we're doing. I was thinking during the break about ways that we could use this theory in order to explain things. For example, take a moment and think of the concept of slavery. And so if you had to basically explain or talk about the institution of slavery to somebody, would you basically say that slavery is more in the context of Gesellschaft, or would it be in the context of Gemeinschaft? Well, it seems to me that if you jump at first blush, you would say, oh my God, of all, to think of an institution where one person feels like they have the right to own another person and have total power over another person is nothing but pure Gesellschaft. It's a classic example of one person totally taking advantage of another person. It's totally self-interested. It's pure Gesellschaft. But then, what if I said, wait a minute, I don't really believe, as I look back on history, I don't believe that slaves, that African Americans, blacks, are equal to whites. I don't believe that everybody's equal. I think that some races, some peoples, are more capable and more talented and have more ability and more intelligent than other peoples. I believe that history will prove that throughout history, non-whites have been inferior to whites. Non-whites haven't contributed to civilization what whites have. Therefore, one would have to conclude that some people just aren't able to handle responsibility and challenges like other people are. So in a sense, the institution of slavery really is not an exploitive relationship, exploitative situation at all. Basically, what it's based on is those people who are incapable of taking care of themselves, thanks to the institution of slavery, can have their basic needs taken care of in exchange for their labor. In other words, slavery is not a Gesellschaft relationship where one person is taking total advantage of another person. Slavery is really my way of demonstrating, putting into practice, God's love for man. Basically, what I'm doing is taking care of those who can't take care of themselves. Food to eat, a roof over their heads, medical care, education, a place to live, a place to work, to people that in a competitive situation could not make it. So in reality, I'm not exploiting anybody. What I'm really doing is demonstrating genuine affection for people who, for whatever reason, have been put on this earth and are incapable of taking care of themselves. Slavery is the most Christian, the most human thing that we can do when confronted with people who are not up to the situation that they find themselves in, which is basically what you can conclude about all the pro-slavery literature that came out of the pre-Civil War South. So in a sense, depending on which of those perspectives you take, that's going to determine whether you look at slavery as a Gesellschaft-like situation, institution, or one that is oriented towards or tends more towards Gemeinschaft. How about education? Education, people need an education in order to get a job. People need an education in order to develop and hone their skills. People need an education in order to make a meaningful contribution to the community or the society that they live in. People need an education in order to basically earn the kind of living, meet the standard of living necessary to take care of their responsibilities to their family, to their wives and children, etc., etc., etc. So education is basically a means to an end. You get it, and what you find out is I love children. I'd like to teach young children, so therefore I go and I take classes and I pay my tuition and I get a degree in such and such. It gives me an opportunity to do what I can do. It's a way to get a job. It's a way to have a career. It's a way to improve your quality of life and standard of living in our society. It's a rational Gesellschaft, self-interested kind of process. But wait a minute. What about education for education's sake? What about the beauty of knowing? What about the excitement and the wonders of knowledge? What about the spiritual side of learning? What about learning for the sake of learning? What about expanding your horizons, expanding your world, expanding your ability to appreciate others, the ability to appreciate good music, the ability to appreciate literature, the ability to read and understand history, the ability to know other people that you would never otherwise know unless you read about them? What about the whole idea of human growth? What about the elements that make the human being so much superior? What about what makes man God's greatest creation? What about the fact that God gave man a mind and God wants man to do what the most he can do with that mind? Expand his knowledge, expand his horizon, expand his appreciation for others, become more sensitive, become more aware, become more capable of helping your fellow man, become much more skilled at building and making stronger the community, the Gemeinschaft kind of existence that you live in. If all of that depends on education, then one could argue that education is more Gemeinschaft than it is Gesellschaft. Maybe what's happened is that a Gesellschaft society has taken a Gemeinschaft institution like education and turned it around into the idea that education has ceased to be an end in itself and instead has become a means to an end, a way to get a job, a way to build a career, a way to get ahead, whatever you want to say. One could take the Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft formula, could apply it to religion, could apply it to politics, could apply it to work, the whole idea of work. The difference between work as a way to earn living as opposed to work as a way to hone your skills and work as a way to allow other people to benefit and enjoy the skills that God was good enough to give to you. Work is a way that you fulfill your abilities, your talents, innate capability is to work. You create, whether it's music or art or carpentry or whatever. Man was created with the ability to create. To create work is man fulfilling his creative potential. It's a way to become everything that man was put on this earth to be. It's a way to fulfill your destiny. It's an end in itself. Think of the craftsman who basically has a skill that few other people have. And the fact that the craftsman is literally able to put elements of himself or herself into what they create. That's work in a totally different way than most people today define work, which is a job and a way to make money. I guess the point that I would make is that if we had our druthers, we'd all opt for Gemeinschaft. But if you ask anybody, I've asked students this, Gemeinschaft is a dream. It doesn't really exist. It's a fairy tale. It's a place that never was and never will be. It's the way we dream that life could be, but it can't be that way. That's not the way people are. The only way to make it in this world is to be tough. Because that's what you're going to face, is one challenge after the other. The worst thing you can be in a society where everybody is out to get you is to let them. If the name of the game is to get them before they get you, then in order to be true and honest to yourself and honest to those over whom you have a responsibility, you owe it to yourself to raise your children to realize that. It would be a disgrace to raise children believing in Gemeinschaft when you know that the minute they walk out that door into this world, they're going to be in a world which is pure Gesellschaft. So now we're confronted with the question. If Gemeinschaft is what everybody would like, if Gemeinschaft is what everybody would choose, if Gemeinschaft is where everybody would like to raise their children, if Gemeinschaft is what they would like their schools to be, if their children got up in the morning and couldn't wait to get to school in order to learn and to experience the joys and the wonder of learning new things, if teachers could go to work knowing that they were going to spend the day among students whose number one goal was to learn and to know and to understand the unknown, and that teachers knew that they were going to be part of a quest to appreciate and to know and to understand, and they were not going to have to go and spend 95% of their time disciplining young people and keeping them in order and all the other things that we know about. I guess what I'm saying is, if everybody wants a Gemeinschaft, then for heaven's sake, why do we continue to perpetuate the move toward Gesellschaft? Because let's face it, let's take the extreme. I've been talking about pure Gesellschaft. Let's talk about pure Gesellschaft. Imagine a place where every relationship, every interaction that you had with everybody else was based on pure self-interest. You knew it, they knew it. Imagine a world which was like Thomas Hobbes' state of nature, which was a state of perpetual warfare where every man was at war with every other man. Imagine a place where every interaction with another person that you had during the day was potentially a threat to you, and a threat to you on the one hand and an opportunity for you on the other. When you encounter somebody else in your day, one of you is going to walk away a winner and one of you is going to walk away a loser. And your job has to be to make sure that you're the winner. Imagine a place, a way of life, where nobody could trust or believe anything that anybody says. That anything that is said, everything is driven by a personal agenda. And that what life was about was trying to understand or get around what everybody's agenda is. Once you understand their agenda, then you know how to cut them off at the pass. So every relationship is a question and answer relationship where you're feeling them out. You're trying to find out what they really think. You're trying to find out what they really believe. You're trying to figure out what it is they want from you. You're trying to get your arms around how it is that they're going to try to get what they want from you. At the same time, you're trying to figure out how to do the same thing to them. Imagine a relationship, a world, a way of life, where nobody trusted everybody else, anybody else. Imagine a world, an NRA world, a world where the only way that there could be peace was based on the fact that everybody knew that if they disrupted the peace, they would likely be dead. During one of the classic episodes of All in the Family, when it was so popular in the 1970s, Archie Bunker and his grandson, his stepson. It was during a time, I remember well, when the nation was absolutely, worried to death about plane hijackings. And I can remember articles and things about how to stop the plane. There was always stories about somebody hijacking a plane and taking it to the Middle East or to Cuba or somewhere. And one of the classic episodes in All in the Family was that Archie and Mike were having a discussion about plane hijackings. And Archie's response was, the way to deal with hijackings is simple. What you do is when people get on the plane, you not only take their tickets, but you give every passenger a gun. And then when the plane empties, when people get off the plane, they turn in their guns. And the question that Archie put to Mike, who in their right mind is going to hijack a plane when everybody on it is armed? In the 1970s, at that time, society generally believed that what made All in the Family the program it was is that Archie was willing to say on television what everybody else recognized to be absurd. In other words, what everybody believed the most insensitive, uninformed, self-interested individual would believe, Archie said. And the audience would roar in laughter. That's pretty much what the NRA is saying today, but nobody's laughing. Everybody's taking it seriously. Between the 70s and the early 21st century, we have progressed to the point in our move toward Gesellschaft where we are now considering the benefits of the solution to violence that society in the 70s believed was absurd. How far we have come, or how far we have regressed. I think the decision on that one is yours. But we now have turned the bottom of our second hour. So let's return to the issue at hand, which is the Constitution of the United States. I don't have a copy in front of me, but we went through in our last 2 or 3 programs together in pretty much detail. We went through James Madison's Federalist Number 10. We basically heard James Madison tell us that Gemeinschaft is a dream. James Madison said that the nature of faction is sown in the nature, that factions are sown into the nature of man. There's no way to get rid of them other than to take away people's freedom to belong to them. And Madison said if you take away people's freedom, you've engaged in a cure worse than the disease. So basically, if factions are sown into the nature of man, and he gives us example after example of that, and he said, basically he said factions are based on different religions and support for different leaders. And then he said, one of the most durable cause of factions historically has been the various unequal distribution of property. Those who hold property and those who are without property have always created distinct interests in society. And it is government's number one priority to manage those differences, to manage the factionalism that these factions create, but do it in a way which doesn't violate our commitment to the principle of popular government. We must maintain a government which has all the accoutrements of a republic, of a popular government. A government based on the social contract. A government which derives its power from the consent of the governed. A government which puts premium value on people's liberty and freedoms. But a government that recognizes that man's nature is one which prepares him for living in a Gesellschaft kind of an environment. What we must do is structurally or institutionally create Gesellschaft, a framework for Gesellschaft, because that's the only kind of system that deals with man the way man really is. That's man's nature. Man can't live in Gesellschaft because he is so self-interested. Therefore, Gemeinschaft, I'm sorry. Man can't live in a Gemeinschaft because of his self-interest, because of his tendency toward factions. Consequently, Gemeinschaft cannot exist. Even though everybody wants it. Even though that's the kind of life everybody would want for their children. Think of the progress. Think of what a society could accomplish if it didn't have to spend its time and its treasure arming itself for Gesellschaft. Maintaining a military presence, maintaining a police force, maintaining a military capability that basically presumes the existence of a Gesellschaft world. Basically, what Madison is doing is painting a picture for his reader which seeks to suggest that pure Gesellschaft is Gemeinschaft. That the only way to create the kind of society that can work is to take man's nature as it is and build a political structure around it. But the fact of the matter is that a system created to address the realities of Gesellschaft requires Gesellschaft in order to succeed. What I'm suggesting is that we have gone from one end of the perspective of the spectrum to the other. In order to create the kind of society which can address the problems which are priorities to Madison, going all the way back to his vices of the political system of the United States. In order to address those problems, we've got to come up with a way to create a political system which is realistic. But the fact of the matter is, when you create that kind of a political system for people, you basically create an environment in which people can only be successful if they function according to the assumptions and the priorities within which they live. Going back, we talked about John Locke and the state of nature. Let's talk about John Locke and his writings on the theory of moral sentiments. Let's talk about the so-called Enlightenment idea, the late 17th, 18th century idea. And this is famous, John Locke. That man is not born with innate ideas. That man is born as tabula rasa, a blank slate, an empty sheet, a white sheet. Let's assume for a second that Locke is correct, and that man comes into this world without any priorities. Man is whatever the environment you place him in causes him to be. Man, according to Locke, is like a plant. The whole idea of a plant is you put it in healthy soil and you make sure that it has proper sunlight, healthy temperatures, nutrients, sufficient rainfall. In other words, if you can control the environment within which that plant is asked to survive, if you can control the experiences that that plant is forced to deal with, then the result is a healthy, fruitful, flourishing plant. That is the product of a proper mixture of sunlight, moisture, rainfall, temperature, and luck. And the result is perfection. Basically, what Locke is suggesting then is that man is whatever environment you put him in, or whatever experiences you expose him to. When Benjamin Rush, in his Modes of Education Proper in a Republic, when Benjamin Rush called schools nurseries of wise and good men, think about that. In his Mode of Education Proper in a Republic, Benjamin Rush talked about schools as being nurseries of wise and good men. The operative word, nurseries. Think of a nursery. Think of a nursery where you raise plants and you make sure that they all have the proper nutrients, etc., etc. In other words, nurseries are places that create the perfect environment for the product that you want. So your plant will become what you want it to become, dependent on the experiences you expose it to, according to the environment it is forced to live in, it lives in. Locke argued that man was the same. Everybody came into life equal, Locke believed, but it was luck, it was experiences, it was heritage, it was the family that one was born into, it was the level of education that he was exposed to, it was the income around him, it was all of these things that basically played a role in determining what man ultimately became and what man ultimately believed. Man was like a plant. Benjamin Rush believed that schools were like nurseries. And if you basically expose children to the proper nutrients and the proper information, and you shielded them from negative information, and you basically expose them only to those things that were positive, only to those things that produced positive results, then you could create the kind of person that you wanted. Or, to put it more specifically, that a republic needed. You could create a student that believed and did and behaved according to the priorities of the person who controlled that environment. if that's true, if any part of it is true, then think of James Madison in Federalist Number 10. Because James Madison is operating on an assumption that human nature is exactly the opposite to what John Locke said it was. Rather than society having the ability to create the kind of man that society wants, Madison argued that our responsibility was to create the kind of political environment that man's nature required. But if there is a relationship between an individual and the environment within which he or she or it lives, plant, animal, human being, if there is a relationship, if there is a learning process, if there is an adjustment process, then that means that human nature is not fixed. It's flexible. It can be changed. Which means that Gemeinschaft is less of an ideal and more of a possibility than anybody would want us to believe it is. Gemeinschaft is a threat to those who have succeeded in Gesellschaft. Those who have attained positions of influence and power and wealth. Those who have the ability to affect the environment within which others live. Have a vested interest, which is, of course, Gesellschaft. Gesellschaft is another name for vested interest. Have a vested interest in making sure that the society that the world or the environment or the experience which allowed them to get where they are doesn't change. The greatest threat to it is Gemeinschaft. The greatest threat to it is a set of ideals or a set of beliefs or assumptions that contradict the assumptions which rationalize Gesellschaft. So therefore, those with a vested interest in Gesellschaft must crush, must thwart, must repress those ideas and those values and those assumptions and those questions which question the reality or the validity of Gesellschaft and suggest the possibility of Gemeinschaft. One way to deal with this possible threat is to basically promote the idea that Gesellschaft is Gemeinschaft, which I mentioned before. And what I mean is that's what Madison does. Madison is telling us that the reason the Constitution will work is because it's a political system and sets up a political framework which is designed to deal with man the way man really is. But John Locke has argued that we don't know the way that man really is, because the way man really is can be whatever we want him to be. So we have kind of a conundrum here. We have kind of a problem. How do you deal with it? How do you deal with people who are inclined to believe that Gemeinschaft is possible? Some people believe that the way you make progress toward Gemeinschaft is to find ways to reform Gesellschaft, is to make changes in Gesellschaft which accommodate elements of Gemeinschaft, and that gradually, once the ball starts rolling, once change begins to happen, once the people in Gesellschaft begin to see that Gemeinschaft is possible, then they will buy in, they will become advocates and champions of Gemeinschaft, and eventually Gesellschaft much of Gemeinschaft that the worst aspects of Gesellschaft will be resolved. People who believe that, philosophers call liberals. But there's another philosophy, which is that since those in the positions of power and influence in Gesellschaft have nothing to gain by change, have everything to gain by retaining or maintaining the status quo, as Alexander Hamilton said, since they have nothing to gain by change, they ever will maintain good government. Some people realize that. So their position is the only way to create Gemeinschaft is to find all the people that believe in it and want it and remove them from the environment they're in into a totally different environment which allows them to create the ideal community that they believe is possible. The perfect Gemeinschaft. And since there were so many obstacles in Gesellschaft, the only solution is to leave Gesellschaft and go far enough away that those who command Gesellschaft can't find you. And that allows you to perform, to set up the ideal Gemeinschaft, the ideal community. That's what many of the founders believed the United States of America was about. That's what the Puritans believed they were doing when they left the old world and came to the new world. They were setting up the ideal community as God intended it to be set up, as God outlined it in Scripture. God told man how he wanted him to live, but the only way that they could pull it off was to leave. Or as Perry Miller says, go on an errand into the wilderness and set up the ideal society. Today, those who believe and articulate and argue for what we call, most people refer to as American exceptionalism, are people who believe that's what essentially we've done. In other words, these are people who believe that the only way to incorporate any of Gemeinschaft at all is to separate from Gesellschaft, on the idea that once people in Gesellschaft see Gemeinschaft, once they realize that it's possible, once they realize that Gemeinschaft is not an ideal that can't be attained, but it's a realistic possibility that man can achieve if man is willing to cooperate with his fellows, with other men, and make it happen, then Gesellschaft will reform itself in order to conform to Gemeinschaft. In other words, Gemeinschaft will become the ingredient, the instrument of reform. It'll be what John Winthrop called the city upon a hill, the ideal community, which will serve as the model for the whole world to reform itself. The point that I would make, and we're at 56 minutes after the hour, so I think we need to bring this together and give Bob Kincaid time to get his program set up and go into his evening program. What we are suggesting here is that the only way that you can buy James Madison's Federalist number 10 is if you buy his assumptions about human nature. The reality is, if behavioral psychologists are on to anything, if there's some belief, some credibility in the idea that people will adjust their behavior to what works, that people will become whatever the environment they're in calls for, then that means that human nature is not fixed, but is malleable and flexible. Obviously, if you set up a political environment, as does Federalist number 10, as does the Constitution, which is based on human nature being defined in a certain way, then what you do, it seems to me, is eliminate Gemeinschaft as an option and claim that to do that is the best way to promote the public interest, which is what the preamble to the Constitution says. I would suggest that for me, the most effective way that I've found to understand the Constitution of the United States is to understand that and deal with it. 58 minutes after the hour, I'm Bill O'Brien. Thank you for tuning in today. This is the Center for the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution of the United States. I'm Bill O'Brien, and Lord willing, we'll be back together tomorrow, same time, same place. Thank you to Bob Kincaid and the Horn, and we'll see you tomorrow.